This is a presentation on recognising and ending the second stolen generation. I'd like to start by discussing the consequences of invasion on indigenous people around the world, and then specifically Australian indigenous people. Then I'd like to discuss intergenerational trauma and the consequences of that and stolen generation of recent history, and how this is perpetuated today through the care and protection system, which has created a second stolen generation. Looking at the states and territories and how they've historically failed to protect Indigenous children in Australia. As all states and territories run slightly differently, I will use the ACT as an example, as I am somewhat familiar with the system. The ACT is introducing a new out-of-home care strategy, which plans to reduce the number of children in out-of-home care, and in particular Indigenous children in out-of-home care. I will discuss the plans for the new system and what ways the government hope to make significant changes. I will frame all of this against the relevant human rights law, particularly the Convention on the Rights of the Child and United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People, and show in what ways these laws seem to be impacting thinking and whether there is a disconnect between policy and practice. Since the 1788 European invasion of Australia, Indigenous people have been impacted and disadvantaged by the invading majority with the loss of language, culture and purpose, and consequently have a negative health and well-being prospect and a loss of self-determination. Removing children from their families was official government policy in Australia until 1969. However, the practice had begun in the earliest days of European settlement, when children were used as guides, servants and farm labour. In 1909, the Aborigines Protection Act gave the Aborigines Protection Board legal sanction to take Aboriginal children from their families. In 1915, an amendment to the Act gave the Board power to remove any child without parental consent and without a court order. It is not known precisely how many Aboriginal children were taken away between 1909 and 1969, when the Aborigines Welfare Board was abolished. Poor record keeping, the loss of records, and changes to department structure have made it almost impossible to trace many connections. Almost every Aboriginal family has been affected in some way by the policies of child removal. Taking children from their families was one of the most devastating practices since white settlement, and has had profound repercussions for all Aboriginal people today. In 1995, the Commonwealth Attorney General established a national inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, to be conducted by the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. The inquiry report, Bringing Them Home, was labelled in the Commonwealth Parliament in May of 1997. The Bringing Them Home had made 54 recommendations. Former High Court Judge Sir Ronald Wilson chaired the inquiry. After Bringing Them Home was released, he told an audience in Canberra that children were removed because the Aboriginal race was seen as an embarrassment to white Australia. The aim was to strip the children of their Aboriginality and accustom them to live in a white Australia. The tragedy was compounded when the children, as they grew up, encountered the racism which shaped the policy and found themselves rejected by the very society for which they were being prepared. The inquiry found that between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 Indigenous children were removed from their families under past government policies, but could not be more precise due to the poor state of records. The inquiry found that children removed from their families were more likely to come to the attention of police as they grew into adolescence, more likely to suffer low self-esteem, depression and mental illness, were more vulnerable to physical, emotional, sexual abuse, almost always taught to reject their Aboriginality and Aboriginal culture. They were unable to retain links to their land and unable to participate in cultural and spiritual life within communities, and unlikely to establish a right to native land. A major recommendation of the Bringing Them Home report was that all Australian parents apologise to the stolen generations for the actions their predecessors had done in forcibly removing children from their families. A key consequence was the experience of a totality of the separation experienced by the overwhelming majority of children forcibly removed under assimilation legislation and policy. Other stated consequences include the ongoing crisis in indigenous health based on the generations of neglect and lack of cohesive public policy. Indigenous children were not only separated from their family but also their community and culture. They were not permitted to use language in the missions, and connection with family members was at best limited and strictly controlled through censorship and destruction of correspondence. On the 13th of February 2008, more than 10 years after the Bringing Them Home report was tabled, the Prime Minister Kevin Rudd tabled a motion in Parliament apologising to Australia's Indigenous peoples, particularly the stolen generation and their families in communities, for laws and policies which had inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these our fellow Australians, as he put it. The apology included a proposal for a policy commission to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in life expectancy, educational achievement and economic opportunity. Intergenerational trauma caused by colonialisation is evident not just in Australian Indigenous peoples, but in other countries also. Trauma and suicide behaviour amongst Canadian Indigenous population, report by Elias et al. In 2012, showed that suicide behaviours amongst Indigenous people may be an outcome of mass trauma experienced as a result of colonialisation in Canada. Evidence has suggested the cycle of trauma, with some survivors reporting subsequent abuse, suicide and other related behaviours, and further that the effects of trauma can also be passed intergenerationally. Today there are 4 generations of Canadian First Nations who may have transmitted the trauma they experienced to their own children and grandchildren. Also in the US, Whitbeck et al. In 2004 had a paper conceptualizing and measuring historical trauma among American Indian people based on 143 American Indian adult parents of children aged 10 through 12 who are part of an ongoing longitudinal study of American Indian families. Results indicate that the current generation of American Indian adults have frequent thoughts of pertaining to historical losses, and that they associate these losses with negative feelings of anxiety, depression, anger and avoidance. And in a study by Goodkind et al. In 2012 of Australian Indigenous people, findings highlighted historical trauma and current stresses such as poverty and violence exposure are related factors in behavioural health inequalities. Historical trauma healing frameworks and through revitalisation of traditional knowledge, culturally based healing practices, intergenerational education and social changes, strategies designed to eliminate social inequalities, they suggested. Today, the amount of Aboriginal children taken into out-of-home care, including babies, is now more widespread than at any other time during the last century. As of June 2014, almost 14,000 Aboriginal children have been removed. This is 5 times the number when Bringing Them Home was written. More than a third of all removed children are Aboriginal, and 3% of the population at the present rate. This mass removal of Aboriginal children will result in a stolen generation of more than 3,300 children in the Northern Territory alone. In the ACT, around 1/4 of children in care identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander persons. As of December 2014, that equated to 157 children and young people. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are significantly overrepresented in the ACT child protection system, as they also are in other Australian jurisdictions. The new out-of-home care strategy, A Step Up for Our Kids in the ACT, will have a focus on diverting children and young people from entering into care and on speedy reunification of children and parents wherever possible. That's certainly their plan. By placement prevention services, which will provide intensive home and other supports to keep children at home, reunification services, which will provide intensive in-home and other supports, professional contact services that will coach and mentor parents, with parent-child interaction programs to assist parents to develop nurturing relationships and to manage difficult behaviours. The ACT do state that there is no target for the reduction of the amount of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people in care, reasoning that they are entitled as individuals to equal protection as any other child, and that the ACT is a small jurisdiction, only taking a small amount of families to leave or enter to change statistics, which seems like a poor argument, but not setting a target to reduce the amount of Indigenous children in care. The introduction of the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People in 2007 was a recognition of the losses Indigenous people have experienced and are experiencing all over the world. The UNDRIP creates a platform for a set of standards and complexities for ensuring Indigenous children are protected and respected. Of particular relevance to Indigenous children and the out-of-home care system are the articles below, of which I'm sure you're fairly familiar, so we'll move on. Convention on the Rights of the Child determines what rights children should have, and that creates a framework within which to make these determinations, since Australia is a signatory to that. The whole of the CRC is relevant to Indigenous children in the out-of-home care system, but the 2 articles that seem most prominent, a handful of articles, are these below. Again, you'll be quite familiar with these. The ACT likes to generally pride itself on its ability to have forward-thinking policies. The ACT was the first state in Australia to legislate a Human Rights Act in 2004, which offers a clear legal basis for promoting, protecting and respecting political and civil rights. It is feasible that in principle this new out-of-home care strategy does have human rights as its framework, but whether this can be distilled into human rights in action remains to be seen.